Having finished considering friendship in Book 9 of the Nicomachean Ethics, in Book 10, Aristotle examines the end of virtue that perfects man, considered himself, chiefly in relation to the common good of the state, but also in relation to divine things, which we'll get into in the next video. He starts to do so by reconsidering pleasure, which he'd already taken up and examined in Book 7 in relationship to continence and incontinence. And for three reasons, he says he needs to reconsider this. Because pleasure appears to be especially adapted to human nature, and especially human education in general, and moral education. Hence, he says, parents especially use pleasure and pain to educate and teach their children, and people who want to encourage children to be well-behaved and discourage them from being ill-behaved, badly behaved, will also use these. Since moral science, philosophy, studies human behavior, part of its job is to study pleasure and pain. A special concern of moral virtue, however, is for human beings to love and enjoy what's really good for us, and to hate and avoid what is really bad for us, to abhor it. Because moral virtue consists chiefly in regulation and education of the concupiscible appetite, in which are located the emotions of love and hate and pleasure and pain that generate all other appetitive movements, including those of the human, the irascible appetite and the human will. They influence and extend to all phases of human life, and exert a great influence on us to be virtuous and to live happily. Pleasure especially so. Unless our pleasures and pains are properly, rightly disposed, subordinated, ordered, related, harmonized, Aristotle maintains this cannot happen. We human beings often choose unhealthy and harmful pleasures and avoid healthy and helpful ones. A person who wants to be virtuous and happy should not choose pleasures and reject pains considered as such. Such a person should not commit evil deeds to get pleasure, and avoid virtuous actions to avoid pain. Just as moral science needs to study moral virtue and happiness, it needs to study pleasure and pain, and thoroughly. Another reason moral science must study pleasure and pain is because, Aristotle says, much uncertainty exists about these topics and about how they relate to many difficult and different opinions. Many different opinions, he says, exist about them. Some intellectuals say, for example, that pleasure is a kind of good. And while others say that it is something bad, something very bad, but for different reasons. Some are convinced that this is true, while others are not convinced, but they say it is. While even though they don't think it's incarnate evil, they do so to withdraw men from pleasure, toward which most of us are slavishly, or tend to be slavishly inclined. They judge it better for human living to call pleasure evil, tell a noble lie, and to encourage incontinent men to hate, to have aversion for pleasure. So a kind of puritanical inclination regarding pleasure has existed in Western culture going back to the time of Aristotle and before. Aristotle, however, does not consider saying what we do not hold to be intellectually right to be the right thing to do, because in questions related to human actions and emotions, actions speak louder than words. If we do what we say is evil, we encourage by example more than we restrain by words and arguments, he says. In a particular situation, all of us incline to choose the object of human actions and emotions as it appears good to us. When a man's arguments are contrary to his actions, people spurn his arguments, and the truth they express is destroyed. Sound arguments convince to the extent that they are in accord with behavior and are understood by their audience. Most people, however, are inclined to identify good with what appears good to us in the individual situation. Often we cannot distinguish by judgment real from apparent good, even the most intelligent of human beings. Arguments do not incline to move the masses, the many who cannot comprehend them, especially when they see a person arguing against pleasure while simultaneously pursuing it. They more readily incline to move those who understand them to follow them. As Aristotle continues his discussion of pleasure by considering Aristotle continues his discussion of pleasure by considering Eudoxus' teaching about it. Eudoxus, he said, taught pleasure is a way of being good, because all animals pursue it. What all animals choose, he maintained, appears to be proper and good, naturally and facultatively desired by animals. And has great influence in animal life because it attracts every appetite to itself. It serves as a principle of motion. The fact that pleasure is not only a good, but a mover of all animals to it as a formal object indicates to Aristotle that it's a most excellent good, because evident that all animals naturally seek to find what is naturally good for them as animals. Hence, pleasure as an object sought by all animals is good by nature for animals. Now, Aristotle maintains that Eudoxus, who was a well-respected man, was very well-respected precisely because he was virtuous. His virtuous gave his arguments special persuasive force with the many and also with the virtuous. But contrary to Eudoxus' argument, considering Eudoxus' argument from the standpoint of pain, it's equally compelling, Aristotle says, because all animals by nature incline to avoid pain. Next, Aristotle presents two arguments from Eudoxus to demonstrate that pleasure is the greatest animal good. The first is that it is evident that pleasure, when added to any good, makes it more desirable. Hence, addition of pleasure to a just and temperate action makes it more pleasurable and better. For a man who takes pleasure in the work of justice, temperance, science, or philosophy, they're identical for the Greeks, is better in these activities, more just and temperate. In the case of science and philosophy, more scientific, philosophical. From this, Eudoxus taught to conclude that pleasure is the greatest of human goods, that enhances goodness in all action. Regarding this argument, Aristotle says, it is flawed. It proves that pleasure is a mode of good, not that it is greater than any other good or the greatest human good. The reason is that when we join any good to another, a greater good results. Against Eudoxus, Aristotle said, Plato had argued, pleasure is not a good considered in itself. Pleasure is more worthy of choice when accompanied by prudence, absolutely and universally. Since pleasure, when combined with something else, becomes better, pleasure cannot be the highest human good. Because what is the highest, most intense good does not become more perfect through the addition of something else. For Plato, good equals absolute perfection. About Plato's argument, St. Thomas remarks that Plato considered the highest good absolutely considered, to be the former essence of good, just as man absolutely considered absolute man is the essence of man. That would exist, for example, say, in Plato and Socrates. Plato maintained that nothing can be added to this essence of goodness that is perfect goodness, or perfects goodness. Other things that can appear good by sharing, participating in the good, which does not exist in this world. So whatever additional goodness exists in reality beyond perfect good is an apparent good, derived by participation in by defect in the highest good. It's actually simply an apparent good, derived by participation from the essence of goodness as an imperfect likeness. Hence, in no way can this addition make the highest good better, more perfect, or the less good really good, because it removes perfection in being good from being an essential part of human life. Essential and perfection, good and perfection, as essentially associated with human life as improving it in this life. Aristotle rejects Plato's argument. In Plato's teaching, no human action, mode of behavior, will be absolutely perfectly maximally good, because accepting Plato's teaching, we can find nothing associated with human life that becomes improved when a good is added to a good. Plato's teaching makes impossible for any perfection to be added to goodness. Perfect good exists in another world. But Aristotle tells us the good that moral philosophy, science seeks is a good of just such a nature that can exist in this life, that makes human life to be able to be, human life's goodness to be able to be added to and increased and perfected. A perfect good somehow must exist in this life for us to be happy. People who hold that pleasure is a good, Aristotle continues, mean it's a human good to which addition, perfection can be made here and now in this life. Not that it's a divine good to which nothing can be added, no perfection can be added the way Plato is conceiving it. Aristotle thinks this is an inconsistency in Plato's thought, maintained both by Plato and students of his, the Platonists, who he says countered Aristotle's Eudoxus's arguments by replying to his first argument that pleasure added to a good makes it pleasure, by denying that while all animals and humans desire is good. Aristotle, in turn, rejects this counter-argument of the Platonists as nonsense, evidently false, because to some extent natural judgment cannot be totally wrong. The natural judgment of our natures and faculties, at least generically, has to be right, since the concupiscible appetite tends only to what seems good, appears good. What we all desire through our concupiscible appetite is seeming, not real good. What is derived by the concupiscible appetite of each person is the good as it seems to every individual human to be real good. So collectively considered as a numerical universal, the pleasure we all desire in this way is good, the good numerically considered by each one of us as good. The person who, like Plato, rejects as false what everyone else accepts as true, Aristotle maintains, has the burden of proof placed on him or her as an individual, and needs to defend the reason for so doing, or his claims are of no more intellectual weight than those he rejects. If only brute animals and evil men by nature desired pleasure is good, suitable, proper, Plato's claim, that of the Platonists, would have some weight. Might be defensible because the external senses only judge good in its sensory particularity in the present as it appears, not as it really is in its nature, which escapes the notice of the external senses, the concupiscible appetite, even the common sense and the sense imagination. But some animals do exist, namely human beings, who possess a particular reason and an estimative sense, and are naturally inclined to take direction from an intellectual reason. These beings, human beings in the concrete, pursue pleasure as a suitable, natural, proper good, and such animals, humans, can understand the natures of things here and now, and considered as such. Moreover, even if all brute animals and wicked men desired pleasure, that pleasure is a good might still be probable, because even in wicked men, some natural good inclination to real good still remains, tends by nature to be desired still by them as a real good. Just as virtue perfects a natural composite whole nature, a natural composite, a good whole nature. In the case of humans, moral virtue improves and strengthens, more intensely unifies, harmonizes, and perfects such a human composite with a qualitatively greater, more intense, unbreakable natural strength of organizational unity and action. So moral vice, as Aristotle sees it, is a corruption, fragmentation, pluralization, imperfecting of a natural, concrete, composite wholeness, a unity and harmony, and organizational strength and action. Evil men become fragmented from, divided from each other as organizational natures and civic beings, and doers of good, qua vicious, but not as pursuers of pleasure. Vice, according to Aristotle, not pleasure, divides. By nature, pleasure inclines to unite. The contrary pleasures that pursue evil, fragmentation, so forth, do not pursue pleasure considered as such. This is the fragmentary vice of evil men that causes them to lose touch with reality, that moves pleasures in the wrong direction. Aristotle continues a discussion regarding pleasure related to students of Plato. He presents a fourth argument against a people he calls Platonists, designed to show that they are wrong to claim pleasure is not a way of being good, a mode of goodness in some respect, at the very least. He proceeds against these opponents by first presenting four arguments he attributes to them. The first is that good appears to be a species of the genus quality, because when asked what the quality of something is, we tend to reply good. Because pleasure is not a quality, it's not a good. Even if pleasure is not a species of quality, it's still good, Aristotle says in reply. We predicate good of all genera. It's not a genus or species, it's a principle that both presuppose, that the genera and species presuppose in order to exist. The Platonists hold, against the Platonists, he holds that good is a determinate unity, causing a multitude to have unity, to be limited, to become an organization or a composite whole. From the fact that it admits of degrees, pleasure is indeterminate, not one, unlimited, a cause of fragmentation, decomposition, disorganization, and chaos. Hence, it appears not to belong to the genus of good, as the Platonists argue. Aristotle replies to this argument of theirs, that it's fitting to admit that a thing admits of degrees and specification. A genus admits of these in two ways: abstractly and concretely. What exists concretely with an organizational whole has an organizational unity and simplicity. It exists as a part of such a whole. Considered in itself a part or a form, admits of no degrees of more or less. Concretely considered, because the subject in which it exists has and possesses this part or form, this partial unity, with greater or less intensity of perfection and strength, more or less what it has, what it possesses, can be said to be predicated, to be more or less. For example, when light, abstractly considered in its nature, admits of no more or less in its intelligibility, while it admits of no more or less in its intelligibility and being, as it exists in something according to the capacity of the receiver to have and possess it. The subject in which it exists is said to be more or less possessed of light. Moreover, Aristotle argues that a form can admit of degrees even according to its own nature, when its nature expresses a relation of proportion of a many to a one, as to a principle, that is, when its nature expresses harmony and proportion. For example, with respect to health and beauty. Different species of beauty involve harmonious unity. And the same with health, more or less health. Evident then to Aristotle is the reason why unity abstractly considered, unity as a principle of determinacy and limitation, that causes an organization to come to be, not unity as a principle of harmonization of an organization, as a principle of action, cannot admit of degrees. The unity that just makes for something to be an organization is different from the unity that causes harmonization. The form that generates an organization causes it to exist. The latter harmonizes it. The harmonizational unity gives it this kind of order that organizations use to operate. If the Platonists hold that because it admits of degrees in the concrete, pleasure is indeterminate and lacks unity definiteness, is essentially chaotic, they will have to also maintain inconsistency, Aristotle says, the same claim about justice and the other virtues. Just as other virtuous actions in people, either virtues will not be ways of being good, or the argument of the Platonists is false. On the other hand, if they maintain that pleasure admits of degrees, the part of pleasure like a harmony, if they admit it of degrees on the part of pleasure like a harmony, they would appear to be distinguishing perfect, pure, uncomposed, unmixed, unimpeded, instantaneously delightful pleasure from imperfect, composed, mixed, musical harmony, or the beautiful blending of tastes and colors. They would have to distinguish between different kinds of pleasure. Obviously, pure pleasure in an unimpeded intellectual faculty, which is instantaneous, admits of no degrees, is totally agreeable. And mixed pleasures that harmonize sensibles of different kinds produce pleasures more or less agreeable to one faculties, to different faculties, to us, considered as a whole. Like the action of an army acting as a unit is totally agreeable to all its parts simultaneously whole. Still, Aristotle says nothing prevents mixed pleasures that result from harmonization from being determinate, like health, while they might become perfect in definiteness, determinacy, even though they might not be totally so or totally one, inasmuch as they come close to it as toward a proper end. Analogously, nothing prevents us from calling them definite, determinate, like we call harmonious integration of bodily chemistry health. A body that is in no way approximates such harmony we tend to call sickly. But even then, unless dead, health remains in a human to some degree. Analogously, the same is true of imperfect pleasure. Aristotle's third argument against the Platonists here is against two of their claims. One, that the good considered in itself is total perfection. Good and perfection are identical. And motion and process of generation are imperfect. They maintain as part of the argument, because motion is an act as a deprived and imperfect. No motion belongs, or process of generation belongs to the genus of good. Pleasure is a motion, a process of generation, or belongs to the process of generation. Hence, pleasure is no good. Aristotle replies that because every motion appears to be swift or slow, to involve speed or time, the Platonists appear to be wrong. Abstractly considered in its nature, swiftness, slowness, time are not essential to motion of the heavens. Swiftness and slowness, speed, are predicated of a moving body relative to something else. And time is a qualitative fragmentation of the whole existence of a motion into ordinately numbered kinds of acts, positioned. An ordinal way of numbering of first and second and so forth exists in terms of before and after in temporal movements in relation to the motion of the heavens, in relationship to local motion related to place. Pleasure can happen, however, in an instant. Time cannot. Time occurs successively. It's what's open to future succession. We call fast, swift, and slow a body that moves a long distance in a short time. We call fast, that is, and swift. A body that moves a short distance in a long time we call slow. Considered as such in its nature, just as what they are, swiftness and slowness are not attributable to pleasure. While a man can come to be pleased and angry quickly or slowly, reach the point of being these quickly or slowly, strictly speaking, we cannot be in the state of anger or pleasure quickly or slowly. While we say a person can be quick-tempered, quick to become angry, come to be angry, while we call anger hot and intense, cold and mild, or of short or long duration, long or short lasting in time, strictly speaking, we do not call it fast or slow as it exists, but only as it comes to be and subsides. It's not short or long as it exists now. Strictly speaking, pleasure is an act of being, not a process of coming to be. It exists in the present moment, in a doing now, not in an approach to a doing, almost a doing. It's not some indeterminate process of generation. Generation is no indeterminate process. It exists within a genus, proceeds from a definite relation, as from a proximate first principle. Chance, the indeterminate, generates nothing, because generation presupposes relation. Generation presupposes relation, and relation presupposes the existence of terms, of limits, boundaries, a starting point and an end point. Since the terms of its relation regarding what the subject of coming to be is and what the subject is going to become, its potency as a subject, are indeterminate, and so is its external stimulus, its formal object. It's impossible to determine precisely what is changing, what is coming to be, and into what. Motion does not just happen. It happens within a genus, an organizational whole. After a relation has been established, fixed between a determinate potency, for example, the faculty of sight, and a formal object, an external stimulus like light. Whatever moves, changes in any way, gets its initial impulse to move from a determinate agent, one with an act proportionate in intensive quantum greatness, proportionate to its qualitative receptive capacity, its intensive quantum greatness to receive, an act proportionate to its power to receive that has been able to establish an organizational, generic relation, unity with it. Too great a power of light cannot establish with too weak a power of sight the generic relation needed to move the faculty to act through harmonization of its parts. Generation necessarily presupposes the ability to establish a real generic relation between a determinate power and a determinate act. In saying that pain is a defect, privation in what exists according to nature, Aristotle claimed that some Platonists considered pain to be a diminishing principle in something, as opposed to pleasure, which is an opposite replenishing principle. Pleasure is, according to them, Pleasure, however, according to Aristotle, is a cognitive, appetitive activity of the soul. Strictly speaking, if the body is replenished, the body should chiefly experience pleasure. It should be the chief subject that is doing that. But strictly speaking, the whole person, the whole man, not the body or soul, feels pleasure. And chiefly, just as and chiefly through the emotional appetite of the soul, just as the whole human being, not the organ or the faculty of sight, sees. And pleasure is no process of becoming replenished, because pleasure is no process of becoming at all. It's a state of being within an organized whole, an organizational whole, a genus, that has become unified into a perfect composite whole, a perfect harmonizational unity of specific parts, like within the crew of a rowing team or a business. Aristotle attributes this mistaken understanding of pleasure, which says it's of the body rather than of the appetite of a soul, to pleasures and pains we experience relative to being hungry and eating, and being thirsty and drinking. But he says not every act of pleasure involves replenishing deficiencies. For example, intellectual pleasures of learning of intellectual and moral virtues, experiencing intellectual and moral virtues. Even the simple acts of enjoyment related to sight and hearing, smell, and so forth need include no process of generation, need involve no opposites of replenishment and privation. The same is true of many delightful hopes and memories, involving no prior defects. Pleasure can exist without pain, without deficiency, and is not a correlative opposite of pain. From their other arguments, Aristotle claims the Platonists drew another conclusion, which they based on pleasures being vile. They referred to shameful pleasures like drunkenness and adultery to conclude that pleasures are not modes of goods. As one counter-argument against this teaching, Aristotle said absolutely considered shameful pleasures are not pleasant, because some pleasures delight in the concrete, in vicious activities, those of intemperate people, for example. To conclude that pleasure considered as such in the concrete is morally evil is false. The right conclusion is that some pleasures are not good for some people sometimes. While considered in relationship to a faculty, it activates as a proper object or formal object. According to Aristotle, all pleasures are delightful and good as such, as all animals recognize. Relatively to the intensive quantum strength of a faculty, using once again my language, the amount or intensity of a facultatively proper good, pleasure can be bad and painful, damaging if too strong. For example, with hard to digest food for a person with a weak digestive power. Just as foods that are healthy for healthy people are and appear so to them, so such foods can appear and be actually unhealthy for sickly people. The unqualifiedly concrete pleasure for human beings is what is generally pleasant to the estimative sense of a prudent man, Aristotle claims or contends. As a second counter-argument against those who claim that pleasure is not a good, that it involves vile activities, Aristotle claims that abstractly considered, unqualifiedly considered pleasures are a desirable good. Concretely considered, they are not desirable good for all people at all times. While abstractly considered, getting good things is suitable, good things suitable for human beings is pleasant and desirable for human beings, facultatively and by nature considered as such. concretely considered for a fool, a traitor, someone who does not know how to use them prudently, getting such things is not good. While bestial pleasures befit beasts, they do not befit human beings, because they incline they incline us to lose touch with real goods. They incline to disorder healthy properties, healthy inclinations of choice of our prudent judgment, inclined to make us imprudent, make us our behavior barbaric and anarchic. In the concrete, emotions differ according to formal objects. The formal objects of virtuous pleasure is an apparent and real good. The formal object of vicious pleasure is an apparent and unreal good. For three reasons, Aristotle says, in the concrete situation, pleasure is not an unqualified good for all human beings, because the unjust man is incapable of enjoying or even understanding the real and healthy pleasures of the just and prudent man, because this person cannot sense them as good. The intemperate man cannot recognize them as real in the same way as an unmusical person cannot hear, sense, or enjoy what a musical person hears, senses, or enjoys. In the concrete situation, pleasure is an unqualified good only for the prudent person. According to Aristotle, the difference between real and apparent friend, a friend and a flatterer, proves that different kinds of pleasure, honorable and shameful, exist in this world, that not all pleasures are shameful. No healthy human being, he maintains, would choose to retain a childish mind and appetite all his life so he can enjoy the pleasures of a child, or to choose delighting in the shameful pleasures of youth into adulthood, even if he never had to suffer pain for maturing. This is what intemperate people do, refuse to grow up. Evident is that some objects would be desirable even if no pleasure accompanied them, like knowledge, memory, virtue, and sight. But without being good, nothing is desirable. Hence, abstractly considered, pleasure and good are not desirable as concretely real goods as such for all people. But concretely considered, some pleasures, virtuous ones, are desirable in themselves. Just as abstractly considered by a mathematician, triangles have no color or texture, while as they concretely exist in reality, they always do. After arguing against the opinion of the Platonists, Aristotle starts properly to define pleasure by first saying that the act of seeing exists all at once whole at any instant. It requires nothing in a subsequent instant to perfect its form. The same is true of pleasure. Pleasure is a whole act, completely existing in its first instant of being. No space or time in which the act exists makes its form more complete. While every process of generation is perfected after a lapse of time, after some time has passed, this is not true of pleasure, which is completely whole as an act in an instant. Every motion has a length of existence which comprises its time. The points that start and end the existence of a motion are acts, instants, principles that start and end, number and order the length of its existence. Every motion is also a means to an end, a final act, which from its start it intends, moves toward, has an essential connection to. For example, the act of building intends through completion of a final act to finish in a last act what it first intends, a completely built or finished house. The builder builds the house by means of, through, a multitude of an ordered multitude being, an ordered multitude of acts, an ordered multitude being a number of acts. A number of imperfect and incomplete acts and motions. Since all these incomplete acts are ordered to one final act, the finished house, these are processes, parts of the whole act, one generic act of building a house. They get their species and proper name from this last act which completes the house. This one whole act of building takes a length of time to finish. It exists for a length of time and consists in a harmonization of ordering, sequencing of many part acts, which as ordered acts constitute a number, not a disordered multitude of acts constituting parts of a whole. The form of the whole operation is one harmonious act with one chief end. The form of the parts that compose that whole operation comprise another operation with two ends, the chief end of the whole and the subordinate ends of the parts. St. Thomas elaborates on an example of temple building to explain the whole action involved. In such construction, which occurs over one whole length of time, one part of that time involves fitting stones for a wall, another for sculpting, fluting columns, a third the whole construction. And all three operations are specifically different as determined by their chief ends. While in intention and completion, the form of the temple is perfect, whole, relative to the whole act. The forms of the parts are imperfect, incomplete, but perfect as part acts. While building the temple is one whole act, a harmoniously unified composite whole, each part act is imperfect in relation to the whole, is specifically different from, but in harmony with that whole act. And no part of the building process in time is the building completely whole, but it becomes a complete whole in the last act, constituting the last instant that ends the building process and determines the processes and its exact length of time. Analogously, the same process of generation is true about walking and all other human movements, all other movements in time. Different kinds of movements through place exist for different animals, Aristotle indicates. As St. Thomas says, birds fly, some animals walk, hop, and swim. Specifically different moving principles, souls, cause these specifically different ways of moving. Within each species of locomotion also different species exist. For example, walking and running fast and slowly, traveling a whole race course is specifically different from traveling part of it with different starting and end points and doing so quickly and slowly. The terms start and finish of a motion specify it. In the case of motion across place, locomotion, these terms are positions or places. A runner, for example, travels along a line existing relative relationally to place, a starting line and a finish line. Hence, in specifying motions, we do so as species of a relation by referring to a beginning term and an end term, a beginning and end, a boundary or limit, indivisible, ones, a start one and an end one of the same genus. The whole of a locomotion, a movement from one place to another, is a movement from one boundary to another. It's a place relation. According to the difference of boundaries that limit the relation and the subject that is being bounded by these limits, the movement involved specifically changes. Hence, building is a specifically different movement from walking. Because the terms of a motion, which is a relation to an act, specify it. And one whole motion can be composed of many part motions and many relations with differing start and end points. At no time in the process, in any part of a motion, is the whole relation, the whole act achieved. To reinforce the last point, Aristotle makes two analogies. Strictly speaking, we cannot speak of seeing as a movement or a process of generation successively attained. Seeing is a whole act in an instant. So is a point and a real unity, indivisibility, neither of which are motions or processes. Having demonstrated that pleasure cannot be emotion, Aristotle starts to define its nature and properties. He does so by observing that the activity of each sense faculty is the activity of the faculty as externally stimulated by its formal object. Hence, perfect sense activity demands perfect condition of the faculty and its formal object. A sense faculty operates at its maximum of intensive quantity or qualitative greatness when the powers of qualitative greatness of receptivity are proportionate or suitable, that when they perfectly match the qualitative greatness of its formal object. When one is not qualitatively too strong or too weak for the other in this relation. Next, he says that while strictly speaking, the complete composite, the human person, not the soul, acts, whether strictly or loosely speaking, obvious is that perfection and facultative act, perfect act, proceeds from the best union of the best conditioned faculty and the best conditioned formal object. Pleasure, then he states that pleasure is a perfection of activity, acting with maximum of intensive quantum greatness, qualitative or spiritual greatness, as St. Thomas would put it. The most perfect act is also the most pleasant. Wherever any activity exists in a percipient, so too is a pleasant activity present. In a most perfect percipient, so too does a most pleasant activity exist. Pleasure exists with every sense faculty and every contemplative intellect in a state of certainty, Aristotle claims. The highest, most perfect pleasure, then, is that belonging to the perfectly well-conditioned sense and intellectual faculties in relation to the best of formal objects that stimulate them. Hence, pleasure is the perfection of cognitive activity. Cognitive activity following upon appetitive activity, resulting in a recognition of being in a perfect or most beautiful state. Pleasure does not perfect in the same way as do perfectly conditioned cognitive faculty and a perfectly existing formal object joining together and uniting. A healthy body and the medical art cause restoration of health, from which, for example, pleasure ensues. Pleasure perfects activity. It perfects activity once the organizations become whole, you see. This is his point. Pleasure perfects activity by way of a perfect formal principle. A suitable formal object perfects activity as a stable, unchanging external stimulus, as a beautiful stimulus in a way. Every sense activity is exceedingly beautiful and pleasant when, at its maximum of intensive quantum facultative strength and greatness, a faculty is stimulated by an analogously perfect formal object. A pleasure is experienced as maximally beautiful when the sense faculty is at its intensive quantum maximum of receptivity. The formal object, external stimulus, perfectly proportioned to it, remains unchanged and activated. So long as these remain unchanged, so does, according to Aristotle, the pleasure and its intensity. Pleasure perfects activity on the part of the formal cause, that is the faculty of soul, the sense and intellectual faculty, and maximizes its spiritual greatness, the perfection of the faculty. But formal perfection is twofold: intrinsic, constituting a thing's nature, and added to an already existing whole. Pleasure does not perfect the soul in the first way, does not perfect the soul as a life-generating principle, but in the second way. It resembles a blossoming beautification of operation, attendant upon perfect possession of goodness. It's like the running of a well or perfectly oiled machine. The maximum, it's like the maximum of qualitative greatness of operation. Being like that, pleasure is the reward of repose of the appetite. in the knowledge of its perfect operation. Pleasure cannot last permanently, according to Aristotle, because the activity it exercises on our bodily organs and the faculties that operate through them tire and exhaust these organs and these faculties. Even intellectual activity causes bodily movements in the internal and external sense organs, like sight, hearing, and the imagination and estimative sense that tire these faculties and organs in even a strong and healthy person. New, strange, cognitive objects tend instantaneously to delight at first. Their novelty, unfamiliarity causes the cognitive powers to work more intensely to grasp their nature. Intense cognitive activity is pleasant in itself. Concentrated, it causes an intellectual rush, a pleasure that immediately generates an intense desire to know more. All human beings naturally desire pleasure because we all naturally desire to live and to live life to its fullest. In its ultimate perfection, life consists in a way of acting and living. We are most active, devote ourselves to doing activities we most love. Since pleasure brings human activity to its final intensive qualitative greatness, beautification or perfection, it perfects life to a maximum. And Aristotle finds most objectionable to Plato the fact that Plato basically locates the whole of perfection, the whole of goodness, the whole of beauty in another universe, and by taking them out of this universe of ours, leaves no room for increase in perfection, in goodness, and therefore increase in beautification of human activity and of the human soul, and thereby prevents human beings from achieving happiness. Because the perfect good, the perfectly good act cannot be perfectly good without being perfectly beautiful, at least in kind. The concluding lecture of this course on St. Thomas Aquinas' teaching on the good, the bad, the beautiful, and the ugly, where we're dealing with his commentary on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Book 10, which is nothing short than a tour de force that should tie up pretty much any loose ends you might have regarding what this teaching involves. Hence, I'm going to get right into it. Starting with Lesson 7 of St. Thomas's commentary. Having explained pleasure's nature and properties, Aristotle says that pleasures differ in kind according to the activities they perfect, intensify in qualitative greatness, especially different perfections accompanying specifically different operations. The reason for this is that essential principles of a species generate essential perfections as limits of intensive quantum, and also imperfections, as limits of intensive quantum greatness of receptivity and resistance to external and internal acts, just as a species form inclines to produce within members of the species a due size physically. Proper pleasure adds to the intensive quantum qualitative greatness of receptivity to its limitation within a faculty, and to the performance of the faculty's proper operation. Proper pain and proper pleasure add an analogous resistance to any activity that impedes a faculty's proper operation. So every facultative activity is facilitated and intensified by its own proper pleasure, toward which its natural desire by nature inclines to aim. For example, seeing within specific limits of the faculty of sight, the organ of sight, are specifically healthy and pleasant. Proper objects proportionately received generate a natural and proper beautifying qualities, perfecting qualities of pleasure for a faculty. Analogously, St. Thomas says that just as a perfect vision is naturally pleasing, beautiful to its possessor, so is fruitfulness for a tree, fitting colors to a painting, shape to a statue, solidity and roominess to a house. So too, in intensifying qualities of intellectual greatness, virtual quantities, once again, to use my language to flush out more precisely what they're saying, these facilitate, beautify performance of intellectual operations, just as intensifying qualities of the sensory faculties do with respect to the natural virtual quantities in relationship to proper sense pleasures and proper receptivities for those pleasures. Proper pleasure and pain are species-specific intensifying principles of receptivity to proper acts within animals and humans that accompany right desire. Proper pleasure facilitates, beautifies, specifies limits of activities that perfect facultative operation. Proper pleasure measures the rightness and wrongness of facultative operation. Right desire aims at proper pleasure, which is a connatural good of the faculty. Every act of connatural good of a faculty exists in a knowing faculty as a principle of pleasure and appears pleasing. Analogously, the same is true of connatural evil. Connatural pain resists alien pleasures and pain, which destroy facultative acts. Proper pleasures strengthen the activities of the faculties from which they proceed, prolong them, beautify them, perfect them, so that they attain their end more perfectly, rest in it more maximally. The proper pleasures are virtues, natural virtues. Improper pleasures are natural vices, more or less. We are born with these. Improper pleasures and pains destroy proper pleasures and pains. That is, we're born with the proper pleasure and we resist the improper ones. After we're born with the proper ones. After showing that pleasures differ in kind according to different activities, Aristotle next shows that pleasures differ in good and evil according to different activities with their differing pleasures by saying proper pleasure is virtuous pleasure, analogous to right desire but better as a moral measure. Improper pleasure is vicious pleasure, analogous to wrong desire. He proves these claims by considering the nature of desire, by going back to the concupiscible appetite and taking a look at it. Desires by which we want good and honorable objects are praiseworthy, honorable, good. For example, to act justly and courageously, and bad and shameful or objects are blameworthy, shameful, evil. For example, to steal, to fornicate, to act unjustly and cowardly. The pleasures by which we enjoy these activities are closer, more proper, of more intensive quantity, goodness and qualitative goodness than are the desires by which we want them. They're more beautiful in spiritual greatness. Desires are separated from activities in time. Remember, in the concupiscible appetite, we go from love and hatred to desire, aversion, to pleasure or pain, resting in what we've acquired through the completion of desire. So desires come before the pleasure. They precede an activity in time and execution. They differ in kind qualitatively from acts performed with pleasure, or by nature acts of an imperfect whole or organization. They precede the existence of the whole act. Pleasures are acts of the perfect whole, accompany it, facilitate it, wanting to make the right and wrong choice is qualitatively different in kind and intensive quantity. It's also qualitatively different qualitatively less praiseworthy and blameworthy than choosing and doing these things. The right or wrong actions, that is. Okay, I'm trying to look at my page here again. Okay. Along with right reason, proper pleasures and pains, and along with right desire, proper pleasures and pains are part of the essential intrinsic measuring principles of complete moral virtue. They are necessary conditions for exercise of prudential judgment in the individual situation, even more so than right reason, according to Aristotle and St. Thomas. The reason for this is that pleasures and pains are intimately connected to cognitive activities of sense and intellect, because both are caused by the same faculty operating as an organizational whole and a complete nature. And they happen simultaneously in the present time conditions and circumstances. Pleasure is so closely connected to the cognitive act that some people consider them to be identical. For example, Rousseau and his historical descendants, who so much dominate modern and contemporary culture. But while we can experience pleasure and pain only in an act of the intellect and the senses, they are not identical. Pleasure and pain exist in the appetites, of principles and will and emotion, intellect and sense. While never totally separated, they are not identical with these cognitive activities. Moreover, pleasure differs according to purity and impurity, that is, according to spiritual, psychological greatness of soul or immateriality. The act of sight, as an example, is of a higher purity, according to Aristotle and St. Thomas, of higher spiritual and immaterial quality and greatness of intensive and virtual quantity, more highly intellectual, more immaterial in its greatness than that of touch, because it is the most immaterial sight of the external senses. Sight is the purest of all the external sensory knowing powers, because knowing is an immaterial act. This is true regarding the faculty itself, its formal object, and the medium through which its formal object, that of sight, comes in contact with the faculty, that is, light. The pleasures of the intellect are purer still in kind. Since pleasure accompanies activity, each species of animal appears to have its own species pleasure, just as it has its own specific activity, just as it has its limits of due size. The specific forms of animal life generate this proper specific pleasure within them. The truth of this claim is evident to observation, to sense induction. It needs no proof. That in which a horse, a dog, a man naturally inclined to take pleasure are specifically different. As Heraclitus once said, the ass prefers grass to gold. Hence, animals alike in species have natural, specific pleasures in which they can incline to delight in kind and limits. The chief pleasures found in the human species are located in the prudent man, according to Aristotle, who synthesizes right reason and proper pleasures, species-specific pleasure. The species-specific pleasures, proper pleasures of other animals, these are natural virtues, originate from inclinations in them generated by their specific forms as from a proximate principle. They know their proper pleasures through their species-specific instinct, not through rational deliberation. But in the human species, universal reason and the estimative sense are the proximate principles through which human beings come to know with precision our proper pleasures. Since the activities and pleasures of human reason are not determined specifically and individually by instinct, but by natural inclination proper to human, that is, free decision, deliberate choice, what delights some men and sadden others, what pleased some men and sadden others, pain them, is not identical. All animals and people delight to take pleasure in what we love. What we love essentially depends upon what we know. Knowing precedes is a necessary condition for loving. We delight well or badly then depending upon what we know. In human beings, delighting well in the individual situation especially depends on having a healthy estimative sense faculty, which can tell the sick man that he's sick when what he tastes as sour is really something that should taste sweet, or that what he experiences as cold to touch is really hot in itself. The pleasures of the prudent man, Aristotle tells us, are the measure of proper human pleasure, in all cases related to human appetites, emotions, and will, and especially to loves, desires, and pleasure. What appears good to the prudent man tends to be so. In the case of health, the judgment of the prudent man matches the sense pleasure of the healthy man and the nature of things. Hence, prudence is the measure by which we should judge all human affairs, whether a human being, for example, is morally good or not. The prudent, it's contained within prudence is proper pleasure combined with right reason. No surprise then that the delights of the many and the prudent man, Aristotle tells us, tend to be contrary opposites. Having discovered the nature and kinds of pleasure, Aristotle says he will consider the highest human pleasure, happiness. And he tells us he needs to do so because by nature all human beings consider pleasure to be human happiness, to be the last end, the first principle and mover of all human desires. What we love most, because all love rests in joy. I'm continuing now from this portion we just started into St. Thomas's lesson 9. To direct human activities unerringly to a last end, a last act, we need to know what is that act. What is this first natural love? To identify happiness with utmost precision, Aristotle then, therefore, returns to his prior definition of happiness as chiefly an activity and not a habit. Because if happiness were chiefly a habit, some person asleep for all of life or most of life could be happy. Because happiness consists in perfect exercise of a vital activity, and not just any kind of vital activity, like sleep, acts of the vegetative soul. It has to consist in a specific kind of vital activity. Virtuous habits exist even in the extremely unfortunate and in habitually good people living miserably. But Aristotle and St. Thomas and the common human opinion disagrees with those who say that, strictly speaking, such people are happy. Aristotle next starts to define happiness more precisely, generically as an activity and specifically as virtuous. He makes this definition more precise by saying that happiness happiness is a virtuous activity desirable in itself, which, by the way, is the way it appears to the prudent man. That is, secundum se ipsas, or per se, using the Latin. Happiness is a self-sufficient activity in need of nothing further, lacking in nothing, unable to be desired as a means for anything else. It is desirable, loved, taken pleasure in per se, and it's accompanied by an intellectual joy included in this experience. It's not accompanied by childish amusement or delights of the animal part of the soul. As such, it's a great-souled, not a small-souled activity, generated by the intellectual part of the soul. Having shown that happiness is an activity in accord with virtue, next Aristotle shows that happiness is an activity in accord with highest human virtue. as the best of all human good. It is the goal of all human goods, all of them inclined to generate it. It's the best activity of the best part of a person. The active human life directed by the highest virtue, proper to the highest faculty, and accompanied by the highest joy. An activity flowing from the highest habit of the highest faculty. A contemplative, speculative activity of wisdom, science, understanding of truth. Aristotle starts to prove all the preceding claims, immediately preceding claims, by comparing the human intellect with human faculties of less spiritual, immaterial greatness and kind, of a lower quality of greatness and kind and strength, that of the irascible and concupiscible appetites. While these appetites can, to some extent, resist taking direction from reason, the intellect rules over these appetites through a quasi-political rule, while it rules over the body as a slave by a despotic power. Aristotle gives some indication of the intellectual soul's superiority in immaterial spiritual greatness in two ways, comparing its power and activity to divine beings. One by a special power whereby it knows divine beings, and by a special inclination of the appetite it has to love them. He adds that happiness is an activity of this best principle in us, in accord with the virtue proper to it, because the perfect activity required for happiness can come only from a power perfected by a habit, that is, the power's virtue making the activity good or best. This power must be a contemplative one, and happiness must be a contemplative act, a highest act, because contemplative activity belongs to the intellect according to its proper and highest virtue, wisdom, which includes science and understanding. For two reasons, Aristotle says that the highest, the greatest in virtual quantity intensive human activity is contemplating highest truth. On the part of the faculty, this is the one most spiritually great and immaterial, simple, uncomposed act, like the divine act. On the part of the things known, it's the most spiritual, immaterial, divine. Because of the immateriality of the intellect and the thing known, it's the most continuous, uninterrupted, unimpeded, lasting of all human acts, resembling the act of divine self-knowing. Of all human acts, it's the most pleasant and self-satisfying, and intensely long-lasting. While all human activities fatigue the body and cannot continue uninterrupted, contemplative acts fatigue the body less than others. Aristotle maintains that the philosophical contemplation of wisdom is the most delightful of all virtuous activities, because pure, that is immaterial, spiritually intensive, great, and permanent from the standpoint of the faculty and the thing known, they resemble eternal acts. Lasting enjoyment cannot be produced by the animal part of the soul, by contingent beings. Such interruptions rarely happen, however, in philosophical, metaphysical contemplation. Contemplation of truth, however, is twofold: investigative, one of pursuit, and reflective, resting in, loving, repose, enjoyment. Just like the concupiscible appetite starts out loving, then desiring and experiencing pleasure and rest. Since the reflective is the term and end of the investigative, it's the better part, it completes it. Hence, people who already know the truth and have their reason perfected by its intellectual virtue, its intensive quantity, the truth's intensive quantity being the form in the thing, by that immaterial greatness, they spend their life more delightfully. The self-sufficiency, autarkia, that constitutes happiness, which is opposed to the anarchia of that of the concupiscible individual, exists most of all in human activities and contemplation, because to engage in it we do not need leisure goods. We need only necessary goods required for social life by all virtuous people. When the necessities of life are sufficiently provided for the prudent man still needs other virtuous people and helpers, other philosophers. But the contemplative person does not. The contemplative philosopher can contemplate truth even if he lives alone. Contemplation of truth is almost entirely internal. The more a person can contemplate truth when living alone, the more perfect is his wisdom, because this man knows much and needs little help or instruction from others. While for the most part in intellectual and practical activities, two heads are better than one, two intelligent ones anyway. In the act of wisdom, the wise man tends to be his own measure, tends to be his own best helper, because those who seek to help cannot tend to be able to do so because they lack the intense abstractive ability needed to grasp the metaphysical principles that are involved in the activity. Happiness is so self-sufficient that no good can be added to or abstracted from it. Contemplation is its own reward, except incidentally. Hence, chiefly, most of all, happiness consists in contemplation of the truth as such. Aristotle gives one more argument to show that happiness consists in contemplation of truth. Happiness, like amusement, involves rest in an end, leisure, perfect enjoyment of an object. Chiefly we busy ourselves, he says, we work, we engage in business to relax and have leisure. This resembles soldiers who make war to enjoy peace. The aim of busy people is to rest, delighting in what we most love, but not in the way that contemplatives do. While previously Aristotle had said that rest is essentially ordered to subsequent activity, we now rest in this sort of activity so we can work better later. Now, because he is talking about understanding leisure in a perfect sense, perfect leisure, as perfect rest in the perfect act of the last act and end towards which all other instances of leisure act are ordered as enabling means, leisure is a special property accompanying happiness, contemplation. Hence, leisure is not found in the activities of the practical virtues. People of a practical bent and inclination do not tend to understand leisure's nature in this sense. This is especially true of political acts related to, and to politicians, related to the common good, like acts of war, and even religious ceremonies, priestly duties, that is, while these ceremonies might be leisurely, considered in and of themselves, with respect to the people who have to prepare them, they're a lot of hard work. Acts of war, Aristotle tells us, St. Thomas says, cannot be ordered to more acts of war, to killing for the sake of killing. If they were, war, essentially, would be murderous. It would turn friends into enemies, so we could kill each other endlessly. Even political life, according to Aristotle, is ordered toward contemplative life of the political body, established by preservation of peace for pursuit of science and contemplation of truth. Because they concern the preservation of the common good, Aristotle considers political and military life preeminent acts of moral virtue. The contemplative activity of the intellect differs from the contemplative activity toward which practical virtues are ordered in intensity of focus, because we apply ourselves to contemplative activity for its own sake and for no further end. Hence, the activities generated by moral virtues, even that of prudence, cannot generate the contemplative virtue of happiness. Contemplative activity produces a proper pleasure, proceeding from itself and augmenting it. Hence it produces for human activity the beautifying, perfecting adornments associated with the happy person in this life, self-sufficiency, leisure, freedom from labor. Hence man's perfect happiness consists in the contemplative life of the intellect. And since for complete happiness as a human life, no essential part should be missing, long life is necessary. The kind of leisure needed for contemplation of speculative truth transcends in kind the leisure through which our reason directs our sensory acts. Engaging solely in intellectual activity is proper to superior substances that are solely intellect. A human being living in this way lives like something divine, Aristotle maintains, unmixed with the body, with the bodily. Just as the intellect considered in its purity and immateriality, that is, differs from the intellect as a part of a composite of the soul and body, so the activity of the contemplative intellect differs from the activity consequent upon moral virtue, which is properly concerned with human affairs. Just as the intellect compared to man is something divine, so the contemplative life of the intellect is compared to the life of moral virtue as divine to human. Rejecting the advice of Simonides that human beings ought not to share they should not strive, to know divine realities, Aristotle recommends, as far as possible, we must strive to attain immortality, the best of all principles, in the best of all principles of man, the divine and immortal side, and exert all our power to live according to reason and be immortal. Simonides, you might recall from Book 1 of Plato's Republic, Socrates calls a wise man, ironically meaning a fool, for claiming that justice is to help your friends and hurt your enemies. Through use of 4 reasons, Aristotle proves his claim about prudence and the active life in the following way. Because they chiefly concern human affairs, the way human beings treat each other, personal relations, these activities as human are the chief concern of prudence. They deal with common human activities like just exchanges, human emotions, comforting people who are sick and needy, and so on. And this is true also of the moral virtues that prudence directs. Some matters of concern to moral virtues deal chiefly with the human emotions, while others concern the body and external goods. Considered chiefly as an intellectual virtue, perfecting the will, relation to perfecting contemplation, prudence is connected to the other moral virtues by a kind of affinity. But chiefly, it concerns the end of the intellect in that way of considering it. Considered chiefly as an intellectual virtue perfecting the estimative sense and the human emotions, the ends of these moral virtues are the principles and starting points of prudence, in relation to which it deliberates about means. In this sense, it's not an intellectual and speculative consideration. Considered in this way, prudence chiefly aims not at helping to perfect contemplation of divine things, but at perfecting human relations in this life by doing good deeds for the common good. In this practical sense, in practical affairs, doing with human relations, moral virtue and prudence unite in the estimative sense, creating one nature to direct the human emotions as a synthesis of right reason and desire, because the human emotions belong to the body and soul. Prudence and moral virtue direct the whole body and soul composite in relation to proper pleasure. Evident is that both the other moral virtues and prudence concern the psychosomatic composite. In this respect, life lived under the direction of these of these moral virtues and prudence as command and control principles is human, inasmuch as the human composite man is a composite of soul and body. Hence, life lived chiefly under the direction of these two principles is called human and active. But contemplative life, happiness, are of a different nature, divine, more excellent in their spiritual, intensive quantum greatness. Another reason that the contemplative life is better than the active, according to Aristotle, is that the life and happiness generated by the contemplative moral virtue has little need for or less for external goods and personal relations. But the statesman's concern is chiefly with human life. Happiness is active, not as contemplative. While both the contemplative and the active man need life's necessities filled, the man whose chief concern is happiness in this life through perfecting personal relations, through daily exchanges with other people, needs many external goods. Moreover, without visible external acts, man's will remains hidden. Many unjust people can pretend that they behave justly. To show we are brave, more is needed of us, an external act. Hence, a brave man should perform such an act, according to Aristotle, external acts. And to show temperance, a temperance man must have the opportunity to be tempted and to enjoy pleasures in an externally manifest way. If no occasion for external behavior happens, if no occasions of virtue and vice, then no occasion for judging, praising, or blaming, rewarding or punishing an action becomes possible in relationship to its nature. And with it disappears a chief enabling means of moral education. Healthy pride and shame, embarrassment arising from private and public conscience. While choice is more crucial in moral activity, according to Aristotle, choice and public display of moral acts externally are required. External display externally are public display externally are needed for perfect moral virtue. For such public display, we need human beings need many things, many more things of greater and noble kind, including the doing of great deeds or the opportunity to do so. Not so in the case of contemplative happiness of the contemplative man, who wants and needs few and external goods, for whom many external goods become a hindrance. Evident then is that the happiness of the contemplative man is more perfect than that of the active man. Aristotle gives a third reason why this is so. Because perfect happiness is divine, as such, contains no active moral virtues dealing with human relations and external goods, it must be contemplative. A fourth reason he gives is that while to some extent brute animals in a way perform acts resembling moral virtue, they do so absent any contemplation of wisdom. Because the gods, on the other hand, have only intellectual life. The life of the gods is supremely happy and contemplative. Analogously, the same is true of us. The more deeply contemplative we are, the more spiritually great and happy we become. The more we display happiness fitting the gods, not fitting brute animals. Having shown the twofold nature of perfect happiness, Aristotle next discusses how the happy man is disposed towards towards other beings. Human nature, he says, is not self-sufficient for the act of contemplation, like a god performs, because to contemplate we need food and a healthy body. Periodically, our intellects must become diverted from contemplating. While we do not need many external goods to contemplate, we need some, especially to execute virtuous external acts like justice. Private citizens of moderate means are able to perform more noble deeds in number than rulers very often, or at least often, because too many external relationships frustrate our ability to move effectively, as in the case of leaders, political leaders. Because busy people, the many, tend to ignore intellectual goods, they have a difficult time understanding how the best of human goods for us, considered in themselves in intensive quantum greatness, in spiritual greatness, do not demand the person to be materially rich or powerful. In practical matters, we treat truth chiefly through deeds, not through arguments, because the chief aim of practical activity is conduct. The truth is chiefly measured by prudent conduct, not by arguments. This tells us more about whether a person knows what he or she is talking about. In practical matters, it's what you do, not what you say. That's the chief measure of determining truth. Because they claimed that external things were evil, not needed for happiness, yet had to pursue them for happiness, the argument of the Stoics that practical activity really is not necessary for happiness and so forth, does not persuade Aristotle. That it's solely contemplative. Since the happy man is most well disposed toward God and things God loves and honors, we are right to conclude that God delights in this person and the part of him which is the most perfect part, the intellect. That God loves and honors this person's intellect, the contemplatives, and is most pleased with the philosopher who is happy in the maximum way. Hence, evident is that, as St. Thomas says, Aristotle places happiness in the contemplation of wisdom, not in a series of actions of the practical intellect. After determining that in both its contemplative and active life, happiness is pleasure, Aristotle considers the end of human life in terms of pleasure associated with civil life by first asking whether his prior discussion of happiness of the active life in relation to virtues, friendship, and pleasure has been enough, or whether he needs to add anything. He settles the question by arguing, for human beings to become morally good and happy, we must become morally virtuous and habituated to morally virtuous living. To gain the habituation adequate to this end, we need direction by good civil law. To achieve the end of moral science, he claims, we do not need speculative knowledge about things. We need practical knowledge about how to do good deeds. Since we become virtuous in this civil sense, doers of good works in accord with virtue, we cannot do good deeds intermittently now and then. We must habitually practice doing good deeds the way good people do them. Persuasive words, rhetoric, do not suffice to make us doers of good deeds in the practical arena, as is evident from experience. Such words can move and challenge to good deeds well-disposed youth. Youth not slaves to their emotions, their concupiscible appetite, those naturally inclined to virtuous acts. Such youth who truly love the good can become apprentices, catechumens in moral virtue and morally virtuous acts and honor, because they are incited to do good works and well disposed to take good counsel, good advice. But because they have no sense of honor, have no fear of dishonor, cannot be dissuaded from evil by shame, but only by fear of physical punishment, physical pain. The incontinent and the intemperate cannot be educated through public shame, public acts of shame. Attempting to use rational persuasion, now this does not persuade them either, attempting to use rational persuasion which such rationally anarchic individuals tends to be a waste of time and breath. because fear, dread of pain, not rational argument, is the only kind of persuasion to which they naturally incline to listen. Being out of touch with reality, they naturally incline to identify good with physical pleasure and evil with physical pain, and right reason with what pleases them, and hatred and right reason in an opposing way with hatred and fear of physical pain as it appears to them. That's a measure of right reason, whatever they're fearing. Is painful. Lacking a realist ability to sense real good and evil through particular reason, they cannot understand real good and evil or experience and understand honor and shame. Not understanding honor and shame, they cannot be attracted by honor or be repulsed and punished by shame. We can't shame them out of their incontinent way or intemperate ways of living, because they tend not to have any shame or sense of honor. Living their lives chiefly under direction of their concupiscible appetites, pursuit of pleasure, having their concupiscible appetites, pursuit of pleasure, having reduced the whole of right reason to concupiscible delight, they incline to propose as forms of hate and violence, as forms of hate speech, whatever opposes their unbridled pursuit of physical pleasure, such as claims that moral virtues exist and that they incline not to be able to recognize and ignore. To such people, anyone who attempts to persuade him or her out of such a life is full of hate, incarnate evil, a hater, today commonly called a bigot. Since to change a person's way of choosing, we have to change his or her way of thinking, and we cannot change such an irrational person's way of thinking by rational argument. The only alternative mode of persuasion to use with them appears to be fear of punishment. Since they incline to reduce reason to an emotional state, they incline to estimate that anyone who opposes their thinking about pleasure must be a hater, using fear as their only means to do so, to which they reduce opposing reason they think that other people reduce argument basically to fear. There's only argument out of fear because there are no real goods and evils except what's good and evil as appears to them and to their understanding of reason. A brutish person inclined to be moved chiefly by love of physical pleasure and hatred of physical pain, a person who cannot comprehend honor and honorable goods, much less delight in them, does not accept the sort of reasoning that inclines to generate moral virtue, as Aristotle says. For anyone to change by rational argument, anyone who holds conclusions by long and strongly held conviction, is close to, if not totally, impossible. To do so, you have to change their first principles or their way of reasoning from them, both of which are held by long and strong bad emotional habits, which are not easy to change. Regarding attainment of virtue during his age, Aristotle says 3 philosophical teachings existed. That men are virtuous by nature, natural disposition, plus influence of the heavenly bodies. That we become virtuous by practice. That we become virtuous through teaching. He claims that to some extent each is true. All of us by nature have some natural disposition toward virtue, but this natural disposition to courage, temperance, and justice is imperfect. Its perfection requires command and control by prudence, which also is imperfect at birth. If all the virtues were located in a disembodied intellect, perfect as an intellect, virtue would be knowledge, and no right habituation of the human intellect, will, estimative sense, and the emotions would be needed. But such habituation in virtue is needed because these faculties are not born rightly disposed in a perfect sense to recognize and follow right reason, right desire, and proper pleasure. Evident is that what pertains to human nature by birth, as composing parts of a psychosomatic whole, causes all our natural powers to some extent, comes to us from external physical causes like our environment and heredity, which influence our body chemistry and bodily dispositions, including emotional dispositions, like lunacy, for example, and from God, who alone governs our intellect, inclining us, as St. Thomas says, to all good, and elsewhere, the devil, who inclines our lower appetites toward moral evil. Because rational discourse, argumentation are not effective with everyone. And because just as soil must be well tilled to nourish seeds, so praise and blame must be used in moral education, reward and punishment too, which contemporary intemperate people are trying to deny human beings, rational agents, to be able to do through attempts to silence free speech in our own age, in educational institutions, among other. The man who identifies reduces reason to the concupiscible emotions, inclines to identify prudent advice coming from the estimative sense and constraints imposed by the irascible appetite in the form of moral virtue as acts of violence. Such a person lacks the emotional maturity and disposition to be able to recognize, much less to listen to reason or good counsel. Such a person, while good counsel can be effective in the soul of a listener prepared by good customs and good laws to do so, it cannot do so in this sort of person. When the concupiscible appetite becomes firmly rooted by habituation in a man's soul, a man's higher reason and estimative sense lose touch with reality as from a first principle, and they become anarchic, become a slave to love of pleasure, and find listening to sound reason emotionally intolerable, unbearable, an act of moral intolerance, violence, being opposed of him or her hate speech. Generally speaking, nothing short of fear of criminal punishment and force of law can compel such despotically inclined natures to do good deeds. Natures who have become our chief political leaders, by the way, globally today. This is a very dangerous situation. Evident is that for intellectual persuasion to be effective as a moral educational tool, right emotional habituation through good family training, custom, and civil law must precede it, so youth can come to love and delight in the honorable deeds and to hate and abhor dishonorable ones. Unless from the earliest age we are first emotionally educated under the direction of prudent legislators framing excellent laws that compel the concupiscible appetite to love and delight in doing really good deeds, for anyone to be guided from youth to perfect moral virtue according to good customs becomes difficult, if not impossible. Most of us, especially young males, who are prone to pursue pleasures and avoid pains, according to Aristotle, naturally find unattractive living a temperate and hard life that refrains from pleasure and does not abstain from real good in favor of apparent good. Consequently, to educate people to become good, to become good human beings and peace-loving citizens, good moral agents, childhood education demands the existence of good lawmakers and laws to accustom and even force youth to become habituated in doing good deeds, loving and delighting in them. So once the habit has become perfected as a virtue, really good acts will be enjoyed by them as such after the fashion of a second nature. Such good laws are needed by youth and adults, Aristotle maintains, so that we are accustomed to do good deeds throughout the whole of life. Getting to the next two lessons in the book 10, and to summarize them, while legislation chiefly exists to help morally educate us to become just and political friends who contribute to the health and preservation of civil society, Aristotle laments that legislators tend universally to neglect it. As Aristotle concludes his Nicomachean Ethics, he says that that before him the success of legislation, political science, putting prudence into customs had been largely neglected. He ends this work by saying he needs to show how to put into practice what some others have put into books of legislation and laws. I hope you have enjoyed this course. I apologize for going quickly through many of these lectures, but I've done so because I consider these lectures chiefly to be an aid to your reading of the texts. If you immerse yourself in these videos, you'll have a good understanding of the readings, I think. At least I hope so. I think in this course on the good, the bad, the beautiful, and the ugly, as well as the course on the one of the many, I've given to you a more complete and precise understanding of the teaching of St. Thomas Aquinas than I have found available to myself in doing my own research. And so I've done these more or less as a summa related to St. Thomas's teaching as essential principles to know about both speculative and practical reasoning. In this work, Aristotle's, if you focus attention on his analysis of the concupiscible appetite, how it begins in love, and then if love is frustrated, moves to desire, and then desire is only satisfied on the concupiscible level by pleasure and joy, or even on the irascible appetite, which has to come back to the concupiscible to be totally satisfied. You'll understand why, according to Aristotle, pleasure cannot be a process, pleasure and joy. And happiness by nature, since satisfaction of all of our entire appetites lies in joy, that happiness and joy must be identical. Once you understand that, I think you understand the first principle that Aristotle chiefly uses, aside from human nature and our faculties, to compose his teaching about moral good and moral evil. Thank you very much, and I hope you've enjoyed this course.